Hey, this is the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your hosts, Brent Aiken and Russell Martin. We are glad that you're joining us today, and we hope that you find this conversation helpful, insightful, and encouraging as you lead your students in ministry. We wanted to stop and remind you about our social media. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Talk Student Men. And then we also have a website, studentministryconversations.org, where you can find lots of resources, blog posts, and then show notes for all of our podcast episodes. Today, we are going to hear an interview with Mark Oestreicher, and he shares a little bit about developing yourself as a leader. Now, Russell, this was your conversation, so can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I had the honor and privilege to sit down with one of the youth ministry greats, Mark Oestreicher, or Marco. And if you have been around youth ministry for any length of time, I'm sure you have heard him or seen him speak or read one of his books. Marco leads the Youth Cartel, which is all about equipping youth leaders. And they have books and host coaching cohorts and a ton more stuff to help you be a better leader. In this episode, we talk about youth ministry leaders, how we can equip ourselves in a variety of different ways for ministry to this generation of youth.
Awesome. I'm excited about this episode. So without any more delay, here's Russell's conversation with Mark Oestreicher.
Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast. My name is Russell Martin, and I'm glad you're joining us. And today we have a special guest. I'm glad to be joined by Mark Oestreicher, Marco. As you may know him, and he has been in the youth ministry world since it began, I believe. So, Marco, could you tell us just kind of you get a 10,000-foot view or a 200-foot view, as long or short as you want? Who are you? What do you do? Why are you here? You know, those things.
Yeah, you bet. Good to be here with you. Well, I've been in youth ministry 40 years. I grew up in Detroit, and then I just kind of slowly moved west. I worked in churches in the Chicago area and Omaha, Nebraska, and then Pasadena outside of LA. And then halfway through the 40 years, I took a shift and started working for youth ministry training organizations. So I spent a decade at Youth Specialties, which is what brought me to San Diego, which is where I still live. And then a little over a decade ago, started the Youth Cartel. So these days, that's what I do. I lead this organization called the Youth Cartel, and we publish books for youth workers. And we also lead a year-long coaching program, like a leadership development program for youth workers. So that's me. And I'm a volunteer youth ministry leader at my church. I work with the junior high ministry. There's I'm heading into my 23rd year of doing that. And I'm currently will be an 8th grade boys small group leader at my church.
Wow. Well, prayers for you with that.
Thank you. Yes. I will tell you, I had them last year, 7th graders. And I think it's my co-leader and he's got like 25 years of youth ministry experience. We were agreeing that this is the hardest small group we've ever had. Yep.
Is that something like just the kids you have, or is it kind of an age or the time they're at? Is it a generational thing, or is it just these kids?
I think it's just these kids. They're, interestingly enough, they're all good kids. They're sweet, and one-on-one, they're all awesome. But they have greater than you would imagine, even for 7th grade boys. They had a complete inability to ever get serious for more than about 30 seconds. So, it was a pretty exhausting year of trying to lead discussions about spiritual things with this group.
And now you get to do it again for another year.
Now we get to do it again. I'm hoping maybe they've matured a little bit over the summer. That's, my hope and prayer.
Well, so you've done youth ministry, you said, for 40 years. And I know a lot of things have changed, but are there any key things that you have seen change? Maybe not necessarily in youth ministry, but as far as leaders, what skills they've needed, or just expectations or things that have changed over a period of time? And you can go back as far as you want, or does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. there's so many things that have changed. I'm just trying to narrow it down, right? Off the top of my head, I'm going to pick one thing that's changed in terms of what we should be focusing on. And then I'm going to pick one thing that has changed in the experience of being a teenager. Because I do think that while the vast majority of youth workers are good people trying hard, and that God is using them in all kinds of ways, whatever their level of knowledge or experience or skill, right? There is also a sense where so many youth ministries are operating with assumptions about success and how to do this and what kids need that are finely tuned for 1986. That a lot of what needs to change in the practice of youth ministry is really about understanding what's needed in 2021. And that's not just about COVID or coming back after the specific challenges of this last 2 years either, right? So I think for youth workers, in the 80s and 90s, we were still in an era where the dominant need of teenagers was to figure out, the fancy word is autonomy. It's how do my choices matter, right? Fuller Institute has their new book on 3 big questions. They use the word purpose, right? And I think that youth workers were responding in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in a way that was culturally appropriate. I don't know that it was ever the best way to do it, but we didn't know better. And that was to create a fun and active program. Now, there's nothing wrong with being fun. I'm all for fun. And even being active isn't inherently wrong. Although I don't think it's what families are asking for today. Keep my kid busy, right? And so, great youth ministries in 80s and 90s, man, it was all about building a fun, active program, kind of like a club, and it often led to kind of insular, ingrown youth ministries, but it seemed like it was working because it was we did it in a way that was attractive enough that kids came, right? So there was I guess I would say the false positive of decent attendance and short-term wins. And I think that the weaknesses of that mindset are now being revealed because it's not what kids want anymore. And most of them don't have space to just have a super busy youth group schedule laid on top of their already busy lives. So if we're going to talk about what's needed from youth workers, I think instead of being excellent programmers, what's really needed from us now is to deeply understand and respond to our unique context and to understand how to respond to the leading of the Holy Spirit. Because ultimately, the most important two ways to have a great, thriving youth ministry in 2021 is to follow the leading of the Holy Spirit and respond to your unique context. And that means not just trying to copy everybody else, right? So that's on the youth worker side. On the teenager side, that dominant need has shifted. And we can talk about this more if you want to, but the short story is the dominant need of today's teenager is to find a place of meaningful belonging, at least what they would describe as meaningful belonging, which might not even be all that great. It might be crappy belonging, but it's the best they think they can find, right? And that lens, trying to find a place for belonging, has become like how teenagers view everything. So they understand themselves through their search for belonging. They understand God through their search for belonging. They understand their relationship with the world and how everything works. So think of it this way. A teenager in, let's say, the 50s and 60s was primarily asking an identity question. Who am I? And that would help them find where they belong. Whereas a teenager today is saying, where can I find belonging? That will help me figure out who I am. And that shift has, I think, not been addressed enough by enough youth workers. So we're still trying to keep them active and have fun. Active, okay, I guess. Fun, great, for the right motivations. But the real need of today's teenager is to find a meaningful place of belonging that will help them understand who they are and what their relationship with God really looks like. So yeah, I was on the phone with a youth worker a couple hours ago, and he was telling me how in their youth ministry, consistent small groups that meet over a period of years are really the core DNA of what they do, and that they have all, mission trips and camp and some fun events and other stuff. And I was saying that while I really believe that you got to figure out what the contextual response is in your ministry, if our goal is to get teenagers to experience genuine and meaningful belonging and create a safe place where they can raise their honest questions and verbalize both their faith and their doubts, I don't know how you do that outside of some consistent, small group approach. Unless your group is a small group, then you can do it in the context of the whole group. Yeah. That was a long-winded, windy answer to your question.
I wish I had 5 questions that popped through my head while you were saying that. I didn't write them down. But one was, so if I had somebody who heard this and they're about to tune off, they have, a little bit of time left. How do you said small groups. Is there anything else you would add to how to create that space? Because one of the things I think is that doubt is very important. I think the church sometimes minimizes doubt. You need to know the answers. You need to be assured, this and I've seen teens, I think one of the reasons teens are leaving is because of they don't have a place to ask questions. So how do you create that space where they can, like you said, find that belonging, either going on with your small group answer or, anything else around that you'd like to share?
Well, first, I guess I would start with that we need to make sure we're all on the same page as leaders, that we, understand the role of doubt in adolescent faith development. And it can't be a reason for shame or judgment or condemnation. Instead, we need to see doubt as this is going to be strong language, but I think I believe it. Doubt is a developmental necessity for a robust faith that outlasts the teenage years. And what happens is that as teenagers come into the teenage years, they have this new ability to think abstractly, right? And that allows them to start speculating and asking what if and why questions. And it allows them to exercise third-person perspective and to consider other points of view. And that rearranges everything. And so they come into their teenage years with a pretty concrete faith, belief system, even if it's not Christian, whatever it is, they have kind of a worldview or a belief system that's pretty settled by the time they hit puberty. And then slowly it starts to get eroded through particularly their young and middle teen years, as their experience of life finds misalignment with their beliefs. And so an example that I often give is, let's say that there's a kid who has always believed, and this is wonderful, a kid who's always believed God answers prayer. And it's pretty simplistic and concrete belief, right? It's not nuanced. And so this kid, is praying daily for his grandpa who has cancer, and then his grandpa dies. Now, suddenly, that concrete belief, which was a good and beautiful thing, is not enough anymore. It doesn't answer the question of why do I pray or how does it work? And so that kid has 3 choices at that point: reject that belief and just not replace it with something else, which is ultimately why kids walk away from a faith that was meaningful by the time they get to their late teen years. It's just been Swiss cheesed. There's not enough of it there anymore, right? His second option is to say, well, it's all I have, so I'm going to hold on to it, which is why our churches are often full of people who have a faith. It's just one that doesn't have implications for their daily living because they're 45 and living with an 8-year-old's faith, right? And his third option would be to examine that belief and go through the work of replacing it with something that's more gray, more nuanced, more abstract, which is where you and I come in, and hopefully where that kid's parents come in, because they often need help in that process. So I would say first, we've got to reframe doubt and questions. They're not always true doubts. Sometimes they're just questions, as a helpful and essential part of adolescent faith development. And then comes the pragmatic question: how do we create a safe place for that to be surfaced? It starts with belonging, right? If a kid doesn't feel some level of belonging, they're not going to raise those questions unless they're just trying to be a pain in the butt, right? They're just trying to test you. And so there has to be that kind of safety and belonging first, and then a climate, an environment where it's been clearly communicated and modeled. This is what we are here for, right? So yeah, I mean, in the practice of my small group, man, if a kid ever raises a question like that, then it is almost always a reason for me to scuttle what we were going to talk about and redirect to that, right? That's the GUI center of what a small group should be about. Now, the challenge, of course, is that they don't, especially with the junior hires that I'm working with, they don't often raise it in helpful ways, right? So it's not like that kid with the question about prayer is probably not going to say, I'm sorry, I know this isn't exactly what we're talking about tonight, but I have some questions about the efficacy of prayer, and I'm wondering if we could look into that a little, right? Instead, he's going to express it in some other way, and I have to be able to discern, oh, he's got some questions about prayer, and then I have to be good at asking questions to get to what the real question is, right? So just like Jesus, we should be more about questions than answers, man.
So I mean, that's like, I was just sitting here, like, again, wishing I was taking notes. I'll have to go back in and listen to it and take notes then. But we're talking to leaders, so people who are some of them are, as Doug Field said, raise their hand to use the bathroom and end up being the youth leader, right? And some are just starting off in youth ministry. So as they are hearing this, and I know for myself, I grew up in that 80s, 90s, that 90s youth group who was all about activities. Yeah. And then I became a youth leader. Yeah. That's how I knew to do youth ministry, because that's how I was. So yeah. Me too. So talk about that, like, development of youth leaders, like just the importance of training and learning, and are there some better ways to learn, or we can't all go get a youth ministry degree, but what are some of the things, the ways that you would suggest a youth leader who wants to make that switch from programs to belonging in their ministry programming? What ways would you suggest that they seek out and find training or development, or whatever they can find in that?
Well, I'm going to say two things that might feel like they're at odds with each other, at least in tension with one another. The first would be, you've got to read, especially in this time when there's not a lot of training things to go to, right? Read and listen to podcasts. So let's put listening to podcasts as a category of reading, right? You have to have some diet of listening to ideas that will stir your thinking, that hopefully God can use to bring about, fresh ideas and approaches in how you're doing youth ministry, how you're working with an individual kid or groups of teenagers. So yeah, there's got to be some kind of input that takes place. And then I would also add to that, I think that then it's hard to do that completely on your own. So to have some means that with which you're processing that stuff with other people. So that could be on your team. Maybe your team is just 3 people. Great. So read a book together and talk about it, and talk about the implications for your ministry. Or maybe you can find a youth worker network with other people that you can process stuff with. Don't jump to like trying to plan events together. Instead, help each other's thinking. So that would be in one thing. The other thing that feels like it's in tension with that is just dive in and start experimenting. I mean, you're going to learn more from what you attempt to do, as long as you're willing to have a loose grip on what you experiment with, and be willing to have failures that didn't work and adjust and try new things. That's a really critical part of the process. I just find that I've almost always learned more from mistakes and failure than I have from my successes. So got to get out there and just try things and experiment. And I will say, Russell, this is the time to experiment, because all of us have been in a really unique phase of the practice of youth ministry, in that we have permission to experiment from our churches in a way that is not normally there. Because of the pandemic, and now starting to regather and figure things out as we move forward, and who knows what's going to happen as we start masking up again and everything, right? All of this stuff, churches are giving youth ministries permission to experiment in a way that is not normally there. So take that opportunity to try new things and be willing to have some of them not work.
Yeah. That's one of the, I've experimented and seen new things. I'm actually experimenting now, because I'm actually now a lead pastor at a church versus being in youth ministry. So as a pastor, as a church, and this could be either pre, post pandemic, whatever, where do we as leaders, church leaders and SPR committees and hiring boards and things, where do we miss stuff with youth leaders? Like where do you see the tension between, or what can we do better with our youth leaders? If you were talking to church leaders or pastors or boards or hiring committees, or those who are, once you hire a youth director and you have them there, like what can we do better that you're seeing is not being done?
Well, I guess the main thing that I think that hiring groups of youth workers have been doing wrong for a while is that they're hiring youth workers for 1986, right? So they're hiring, they're so often looking for a Pied Piper who will go lead this isolated group of teenagers in a way that functions completely separate or almost completely separate from the rest of the church. And, that's another thing that we've learned from good research on adolescent faith development over the last 15 years is that teenagers need to be a part of the church if their faith is going to last beyond their teenage years. If they're active in youth group and not connected with the church, it's highly unlikely that they will stick with their faith and church attendance beyond graduation. So we've got to, those hiring groups have to reframe what they're hiring. Instead of hiring a Pied Piper to go lead an isolated, fun group that meets in a room on the other side of the church parking lot, they need to be hiring, okay, I'm going to introduce a word that not everybody will be familiar with. They need to hire a gadfly. A gadfly is an annoyance. We need to hire youth workers who their primary responsibility is to remind the congregation of the congregation's responsibility to the teenagers in their midst, right? And that youth workers, first and foremost, are supposed to be banner wavers for teenagers, reminding us all in your Methodist context, it would be reminding the congregation of their vows that they made to kids at baptism, right? So that's the most important job, really. And so if we hire people with that mentality, then it's different than saying what we really want is for you to make it really fun and increase numbers. How are you going to do that, right? Because then the expectation is set, and you hire somebody who's going to work toward those expectations, and it's not what's dominantly needed today. You might be able to get the numbers. I mean, I can increase the size of your youth group if you just, let me buy beer for everybody, right? So you might be able to increase the numbers, but I would suggest that transformation is not going to increase.
No.
Yeah.
Now, I went through a coaching certification, and I've utilized all of that information. I've only done a couple of people who I've coached, but within my youth ministry and with my church now and such. So if I was hiring somebody to be a coach, if I was seeking a coach and finding a coach, like what does that do? What is the benefit of that? Why should I do that? And what's the benefit of finding that coach?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier about needing dialogue in order to grow, right? So, I mean, a good coach is going to help you figure out what you need to know or learn or grow in, and then help you chart a course toward that. So whether that's, somebody entering into a one-on-one coaching relationship with you or somebody else who's trained to do that, or whether it's the group process that we use in our youth ministry coaching program. And in our program, we've got 10 youth workers who meet periodically through the course of a year and go through a wide variety of things, from some training pieces to some group processes and problem solving to some honest sharing about life. And all of that kind of stuff creates an environment where we're both able to consider new ideas, as well as to hopefully get some promptings from the Spirit about how we should grow or what we should be experimenting with.
Okay. And for me, like I said, that was a great process for me. Just not the cohort. I didn't do that. I want to do that at some point. I'd like to do more Enneagram work at some point and deal with y'all with some of those things as well. Okay. That's it. What do you tell someone who's now who feels a call for youth ministry? Like if you were going to warn, if someone hadn't entered youth ministry yet, you're going to say, hey, here's what you need to do. Here's what to watch out for. Here's what to hone in on. You've already mentioned several of these things. I know you're probably going to have some things going to be repeat. But is there anything else you want to add to somebody who was, feeling a call for youth ministry going into post-pandemic, new youth, what's coming up in the next 10 years or so?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing should be really obvious, and that's that you've got to get in real, difficult, beautiful, meaningful relationships with real teenagers. So find a church to start volunteering in, or go get an internship at a church or something, right? I mean, I continue at 40 years in this, I continue to learn stuff about teenagers all the time. And it's because even though my day job is training youth pastors, my role at my church is the 15 guys in my small group, or 12, I guess it is. Right? That's my role. And as I engage with those kids, that's my primary point of learning, right? So it's got to start there. I mean, if you're a young person and you're feeling a call to youth ministry, there's some great higher education options for you to consider, for sure. And I totally would not dissuade you from, considering something like that, a youth ministry degree. But I also think that a lot can be learned on the job, in the right place, particularly, as well as through reading and dialogue with other people. So that's what I would do. If I feel called to it, I would ask somebody like Russell, or shoot me an email or whatever. What are the first 5 books I should read? And, who's a youth worker in my area that I should get to know?
Oh, okay. So what are you don't have to give me 5, but what are 3 to 5 of the books? What do you got? We'll put them in the notes so people can look them up.
Oh,
and they can be yours or they can be somebody else's, but just.
Oh, that would have been great if I'd had a list ready
just
for
off the top of your head.
I will say probably the most important youth ministry book written in the last decade, maybe ever, is Ken Dean's book, almost Christian. It's dense and it's not an easy read. But hey, if you're serious about youth ministry, you've got to read that book. It's better than any other book in defining the faith of teenagers today, and kind of how we got here, and a little bit of proactive ideation about what do we need to do. So that would be my starting point for people. Man, that's going to take you a few months. It's long and it's dense. I personally had to reread many paragraphs. So that would be a good starting place. I do think that the first Sticky Faith book, Sticky Faith for Youth Workers from Fuller Youth Institute, would be a really, really helpful read. I think some of the stuff that I talked about early in this conversation about the changes in the needs of teenagers and the rise of belonging as dominant need, that's stuff that I outlined in a book of mine called Youth Ministry 3.0. There are parts of the book that are a little bit dated because it's about a dozen years old, but that framework, I think, still holds true and is worth reading. I might suggest another little easy read that I wrote called What's Right About Youth Ministry. So I had to think about the title. It's just a book that outlines, well, the subtitle is 6 Values That Great Youth Ministries Embrace. So kind of talks about what are the things that I should be thinking about in terms of values that would drive our youth ministry. There's 4. How's that as a starting point?
So I'm going to ask you, you mentioned the 6 values. Can you have just 3 of those values that you mentioned in that book? Or 3 of the values that you think of right now?
Let's see. Well, I've already mentioned a couple of them. So contextualization is one of them, understanding your unique context and responding to it. And then the role of the Holy Spirit. How do I grow in spiritual discernment? So whether I'm thinking about what to program or not, or whether I'm figuring out whether I should how I should respond to that kid's off-topic comment in my small group, all of that will be better if I'm following the leading of the Spirit rather than just working off my own experience and knowledge, right? So those would be the 2. There's valuing small, the importance of small as opposed to valuing large. And that includes the power of small churches and small youth ministries. There's understanding the role of parents and how to effectively work alongside them rather than in competition with them. And there's 2 more.
Well, you just created like 8 more podcast topics for me to talk with about different people. Because I love the values nice. Small and small church. And, I'm in a small church now. And small groups. And I think there's some things, I think there were some small churches and things that were set up to better weather the pandemic than some large churches in some cases. So all those are really good. One thing I've asked people on the podcast, I've asked business leaders, I've asked church leaders, and you can think of this in your context of the youth cartel and what y'all are doing with training. You could also think of it with your small group. Are there things that you stopped doing because of the pandemic that you'll never start again? That you realize, hey, we really didn't need to do that in the first place? Or are there things that you started during the pandemic that you're going to keep doing, that it helped you to realize, oh, this was a value? An example for me was we started doing those Zoom hangouts with college students. And I was like, Zoom's been here for years. This ability has been here for years. Why have I never got the college students together on a Thursday night and did a Bible study or a game night or something like that? So that's an example of that. So is there anything for you in any context that you can think of that you want to share?
Yeah, it's interesting you share that example because in the foreword to the book or the intro to the book that we published called Youth Ministry in This Season of Disruption, which is all about doing ministry in the pandemic, I wrote that I don't think Zoom is going to be. We quickly learned. We initially thought Zoom's the answer to all our problems, and then we quickly realized, oh my gosh, Zoom is not the answer to all our problems. However, I did say in that intro, I think it's going to suddenly raise this question of why were we not using this with our college students who are geographically dispersed. I'm glad you're doing that. I will say that the youth cartel has stopped a bunch of stuff in the last few years. I'm not sure it's because of the pandemic. I think it's a good thing we had stopped them. For example, we were doing a lot of training events, and we kind of pivoted away from that just before the pandemic. And it's a good thing we did, because that's just a dead space at the moment. In my youth ministry, the youth ministry where I'm a volunteer, I live in San Diego, and it's the best weather year round, right, in the United States. So, for example, we met online, which I'll just say it sucked, and it did not work all that well. I mean, we got, maybe 1/4 of our kids at the most, and it was a holding place. We had to do it. There was no other options for a little bit, but then we started meeting in the church parking lot. And now we're not going to do that this year. I hope we're not going to have to do that this coming year. But we were fine. I mean, yes, it was additional challenges even for my small group, because they were so rowdy, and being in an outside space certainly didn't help that. But we met through the whole year in person after a few months of not meeting. But starting last September, we met outside, and even if it was cold by our standards, right? So I think this isn't a great answer to your question, but there was definitely a sense coming through it that we're going to be fine. Yeah, I think most churches are not going to get back to their pre-COVID numbers. Like, one of the changes that's definitely expedited is that how families define regular attendance we're going to find it has dropped dramatically. So, I think the numbers that I've seen is that the last number of good recording on that, just pre-pandemic, was 1.7 times a month of attending Sunday worship was what people thought of as regular attendance. And it was already down from a year earlier being 1.9 times a month. I think now we're going to find that once a month, I'm just spitballing here, but once a month is going to be what a lot of people think of as regular attendance. And there will be some parallel of that in the youth ministry world, I think. Maybe not as dramatically so, because teenagers really do value being together. And whereas, I guess it's what you're serving, right? If what people are doing when they attend church is just consuming, then they can come once a month and get topped off and feel like I'm doing it. But if kids are coming to youth group and getting something more than just being entertained or having a up with people talk or something like that, if they're actually experiencing a meaningful place of belonging, then they're going to want to be there more, right? It still might not materialize into the big numbers that we had when we were really putting on a good show, but hopefully it'll be, meaningful, right? So that wasn't a very good direct answer to your question.
You got into some great things there. What keeps you encouraged, or what should keep me encouraged when, when 2 years ago I had 80 kids coming on a Wednesday night, or 60 kids coming on a Wednesday night, and then all of a sudden that's, like you said, down by a third or down by half. For me as a pastor, I can see that as a church, but in the youth ministry, how do we stay encouraged whenever we realize, oh, this is not what it was? Everything has changed.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would start with a theological conviction, which is just God wasn't caught off guard by the pandemic, right? And we're going to be fine, right? It might be hard, right? The decrease in numbers might mean that we have budget challenges. there's no question that giving is on a decline for decades to churches, that is, and it's going to continue to decline. So we might have some challenges to face, but those challenges could bring about some healthy experimentation and innovation. So I'm not freaked out by it. But then I'm also not in a place where somebody's measuring my worth based on attendance, which I realize is a challenge that a lot of youth workers do have to live with.
Yeah. Or churches or whatever, pastors or, attendance is a big deal. Well, it has been awesome to talk with you and to hang out with you for a little bit. And I know it's been a long time in the works of emailing back and forth and interrupting you while you're in Alaska. I hope your Alaska trip was great. So anything that you would want to close or share or to tell us before, as we begin to wrap up?
I mean, just, hey, youth worker, be encouraged, man. I mean, yes, grow in your knowledge. Yes, grow in your own health in every way that you could define that. But at the end of the day, God has placed you in this role in the lives of teenagers, and it's not about your brilliance, right? I was speaking a week or two ago to some kids about the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and we were noting together that the kids' lunch that he contributed was extremely unimpressive in quantity or quality. And it has, what took place there was not about the quality or the quantity of the kids' gift. It was about the quality and the quantity of Jesus's power. And that's directly transferable to our practice of youth ministry. Man, with my small group, I am regularly feeling over my head with these kids. But ultimately, if awesome stuff happens, it's not that I don't play a role, because there's no question. I'm invited into partnering with Jesus in the restoration of the world, which in this case means working with these junior high boys, right? But it's God that's going to do the transformative work. So I need to relax, enjoy the ride.
That was great. Like, I just want to cut that and make that into a whole soundbite. That was really, really good. Where can somebody wants to find out more about you, about speaking, about books, about the coaching, the cartel, training, cohorts, all that stuff, how do we reach you and get a hold of you?
Well, theyouthcartel.com is the primary place to find me. And that's got our books as well as our coaching stuff and everything else on there. I do have a little podcast. We have a podcast network, actually, but one of them is me, and it is tiny. It is 5 minutes with Marco. That's the name of it. So it's just me talking about some youth ministry topic for 5 minutes, and you can find that on all the places you might find a podcast.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I hope that prayers for you with your small group and your new eighth graders.
Thank you.
Eighth graders you're continuing with as you continue that. So thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. It was great to be with you.
Man, that was great. Hey, thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope that you were encouraged and inspired by this week's episode, and that you found tools that you can use as you pour into the lives of the students that you work with.
Yeah, and just a reminder, if you enjoyed this or you found it helpful, please leave a comment, leave a rating wherever you're listening. And also maybe share this with someone else. Take a moment and share it on social media. Tag someone you know who could listen to this, and also tag us at Talk Student Men on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. So Brent, I understand that next week's going to be a little different. Can you tell us about what's going to go on?
Yeah, so next week we're planning something a bit different than our normal episode style. We are going to be celebrating the first 16 episodes of our podcast by going back and looking at different favorite moments from conversations that we have had. And I mean, it's still crazy to me that we have put out an episode every week since our introduction episode on April 29th. We've had some fantastic guests and some great insight on topics that are all focused around youth ministry, but we've also had a great time learning ourselves from these conversations, which leads me to a bit of a shameless plug. If you have been listening to us and think that you have something to join the conversation with, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to shoot us a DM on any of our social media channels, or you can go to studentministryconversations.org, and we have Facebook Messenger built into our site at the bottom right-hand corner. You can send us a message and we can talk about getting you on the show, or we'd just love to hear from you in general, whether you have comments or questions or ideas for the podcast. We'd love to hear from you. We hope that one message comes across more than anything else with this podcast, and it's that no matter how long you've been in youth ministry, you have a voice and people can learn from your experiences. So we would encourage you to come join the conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely looking forward to that and that time of remembering and looking back and then looking forward to the future. So I know we have some other great episodes already lined up and interviews coming in our next kind of fall season. And so we look forward to connecting with you. Again, join us next week, follow us on socials, and we'll see you next time.